The applause in the grand ballroom of the Sterling building was deafening. Ethan Clark smiled with genuine pride as his wife, Evelyn, stood under the spotlight, clutching the Innovator of the Year award. And most importantly, she purred into the microphone, her eyes scanning the crowd, but somehow bypassing his table. "I have to thank my real partner. Without you, none of this empire would exist." The crowd swooned at the romantic gesture, but Ethan's smile faltered. Before he could process her strange phrasing, his phone buzzed heavily against his chest. Do you love stories about hidden truths and the high price of betrayal? Stay with us as this cinematic journey unfolds. The crystal chandeliers of the Sterling building's grand ballroom cast a golden, cinematic glow over the city's most influential elite. Ethan Clark sat at the center table, his tailored tuxedo feeling perfectly comfortable as he swirled a glass of vintage champagne. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of everything they had built. 7 years of marriage, countless late nights, and endless sacrifices had all led to this exact moment. On the magnificent stage, his wife, Evelyn Brooks, looked nothing short of ethereal. Her emerald green silk gown caught the spotlight, mirroring the fierce, calculating intelligence in her eyes. She was holding the heavy glass trophy for Innovator of the Year, the highest honor the Ashford Media Group could bestow. The room hung onto her every word. She was magnetic, commanding the space with the effortless grace that had made Ethan fall in love with her nearly a decade ago. Building this company wasn't just about late nights and endless pitch decks. Evelyn's voice echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system, smooth and honeyed. She paused, letting the silence build anticipation. It required unconditional support. And most importantly, I have to thank my real partner. Without you, none of this empire would exist. You gave me the courage to take the leap. A collective, adoring ah rippled through the audience. Several executives at Ethan's table turned to smile warmly at him, raising their glasses in a silent toast to the supportive husband. Ethan smiled back, a practiced, modest curve of his lips. But beneath the table, his stomach knotted. Evelyn hadn't looked at him. When people make grand, romantic declarations in front of 1,000 people, they seek out the eyes of the one they are talking about. But Evelyn's gaze had drifted to the left side of the room, lingering briefly on table 4, where her co-founder, Chad Hunter, sat swirling his scotch. Ethan tried to shake off the sudden chill creeping up his spine. It was just stage fright, he told himself. A trick of the sweeping spotlights. Then, a sharp, prolonged vibration broke his train of thought. His phone buzzed in the inner breast pocket of his tuxedo. Usually, Ethan would ignore it during such an important event, but the vibration didn't stop. It buzzed twice, then 3 times in rapid succession. An emergency, perhaps? Shielding the screen with his hand under the table, Ethan pulled the device out. The brightness was turned down, but the notification was crystal clear. It was a message from an unknown number. No text, just 3 high-resolution image files. Frowning, Ethan tapped the first image to download it. The ballroom around him seemed to fade into a muted, underwater hum. The image loaded. It was Evelyn. She was wearing the exact same emerald green dress she had on right now. But she wasn't on a stage. She was in the dimly lit hallway of a luxury hotel, pressed against the wall. And the man holding her face, kissing her with a desperate, familiar hunger, was Chad Hunter. Ethan's thumb hovered over the screen, his breath hitching in his throat. He swiped to the next photo. It was a screenshot of a text exchange. "Chad, you look breathtaking tonight. Tell the husband to go home early." "Evelyn, don't worry, darling. I'll make sure to thank my real partner on stage just for you." Ethan slowly raised his head, looking through the sea of applauding guests, straight at the woman glowing under the spotlight. The thunderous applause snapped Ethan back to reality, though the world now felt separated from him by a thick, suffocating pane of glass. He slid the phone back into his tuxedo pocket, the sleek metal casing suddenly feeling like a burning coal against his ribs. Around him, the titans of New York's corporate sphere were rising to their feet for a standing ovation. Operating purely on muscle memory, Ethan commanded his legs to push him upward, joining the sea of clapping hands. His face, trained by years of grueling, high-stakes venture capital negotiations, automatically arranged itself into a mask of beaming, unwavering pride. Evelyn glided down the velvet-lined steps of the stage, the heavy glass trophy clutched delicately in her manicured hands. The sweeping spotlights tracked her every movement. A swarm of event photographers immediately descended, their camera flashes exploding like miniature lightning storms, momentarily blinding him. "Ethan, get in here," shouted Mark Stevens, the senior PR director for Ashford Media Group, gesturing frantically over the heads of the crowd. "We need the power couple shot for the morning press release. Front page material." Ethan stepped forward. His polished Oxford shoes felt impossibly heavy on the plush carpet. As Evelyn turned to him, her smile was radiant, absolutely picture-perfect. She wrapped her free arm around his waist, pulling him tightly against her side. The familiar scent of her signature perfume filled his senses, a rare, expensive fragrance he had specifically sourced for their 5th anniversary. But tonight, beneath the elegant floral notes, his heightened senses detected a faint, lingering trace of something bitter. A dark, musky cologne that certainly did not belong on his bathroom counter. "Smile, my love," Evelyn murmured through perfectly gritted, impossibly white teeth, her voice barely a whisper beneath the roar of the ballroom. The lead investors are watching table one. The investors, not their friends, not their peers. The investors. Ethan wrapped his arm around her shoulders, his fingers lightly grazing the bare, cold skin of her back. She felt entirely rigid under his touch, positioned not for an intimate embrace, but for an optimal camera angle. It struck him then, a cold realization cutting through the shock. She managed every public interaction they shared with this exact, terrifying precision. It was never about genuine affection. It was about flawless optics. Their entire 7-year marriage suddenly felt less like a romantic partnership and more like a carefully drafted, highly profitable corporate merger. He forced a gentle, admiring gaze downward at his wife, playing his assigned role to perfection while his mind obsessively replayed the digital evidence burning in his pocket. He wasn't her husband. He was just a well-dressed prop in her meticulously directed play. "Perfect. Hold that. One more looking at each other," the lead photographer instructed, adjusting his lens. Before Ethan could adjust his stance to look into the eyes of the woman who had just shattered his reality, a smooth, confident baritone voice cut through the noise of the flashing cameras. "Congratulations, Evie. A truly magnificent speech." Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't need to turn his head to know who was standing just outside the frame of the photograph. The scent of the dark, musky cologne suddenly grew overwhelmingly strong as Chad Hunter stepped into their personal space. The post-award reception was a blur of clinking crystal and hollow, echoing laughter. The grand ballroom had been swiftly transformed into an expansive, dimly lit lounge, filled with Ashford Media Group's top executives and aggressive venture capitalists. Ethan stood near a towering ice sculpture, his face a meticulously sculpted mask of polite interest as he watched his wife hold court. Chad Hunter materialized beside them from the crowd, seamlessly handing Evelyn a fresh flute of champagne. "To the innovator," Chad said, his voice a smooth, practiced purr. He turned to Ethan, a patronizing smile playing on his lips. "And to the man who holds the fort. We couldn't have done it without your capital, Ethan." Ethan met Chad's gaze, his own eyes flat and unreadable. "It takes a village, Chad. Or, in this case, a very tight partnership." Evelyn let out a breathy, tinkling laugh that sounded completely foreign to Ethan's ears. She placed a manicured hand lightly on Chad's forearm. It was a fleeting, strictly professional touch to any outsider, but Ethan's newly awakened senses caught the subtle, lingering pressure of her fingertips against the dark wool of Chad's suit. He also caught the distinct scent of the musky cologne again, the exact same scent that had been faintly clinging to Evelyn's skin just moments prior. Then, Chad reached up to adjust his silk tie. As his arm moved, the crisp white French cuff of his shirt slid back, revealing the heavy timepiece secured to his wrist. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It was a bespoke Swiss chronometer, featuring a distinct matte black titanium dial and a highly intricate tourbillon movement. Just 3 months ago, for their 7th anniversary, Evelyn had presented Ethan with that exact, supposedly one-of-a-kind watch. She had spun a lavish, emotional tale about commissioning a master horologist in Geneva, assuring Ethan that the design was entirely unique, drafted exclusively for his wrist. "There isn't another one like it in the world," she had whispered against his neck that night. Yet here it was, gleaming under the reception lights, strapped to the wrist of the man currently exchanging a silent, loaded glance with his wife. She hadn't just bought her lover an expensive gift. She had bought them matching tokens of her affection, recycling the same romantic lie to placate her husband. A nauseating wave of clarity washed over Ethan. The watch wasn't a symbol of her devotion to him. It was a branding iron, a way for her to mark her territory on both of them. A private joke she wore right in front of his face. "Beautiful timepiece, Chad," Ethan noted, his voice dropping to a deceptively casual register. He took a slow sip of his champagne, never breaking eye contact. "It looks incredibly exclusive." Chad glanced down at his wrist, a flicker of smug satisfaction crossing his sharp features. "It was a gift from someone who truly understands my value to the company. Very rare." "I can imagine," Ethan replied softly. The crystal glass in his hand felt fragile, as if it might shatter under the sudden, white-hot grip of his fingers. The air in the VIP lounge of the Sterling building was thick with the scent of expensive hairspray and wilting floral arrangements. A high-profile business magazine had secured exclusive access for a post-award spread, and the photographer was currently obsessing over the lighting setup. Ethan stood near a velvet rope, his hands shoved deep into his tuxedo pockets, the fabric around his phone burning a hole into his hip. Evelyn practically glided across the room, her emerald gown catching the harsh, artificial light. She moved with the triumphant energy of a woman who had just conquered the world, utterly oblivious to the storm brewing within her husband. "Ethan, darling," she called out, her voice dropping into the husky, intimate register she reserved for public displays of affection. "They want us over by the balcony for the cover shot. The skyline will look incredible." He didn't move immediately. For the first time in their 7-year marriage, the sound of his name on her lips didn't feel like a caress. It felt like a command from a director to an extra. He slowly pulled his hands from his pockets, the chill of the room finally seeping into his bones. "Coming," he said, his voice completely devoid of inflection. As he stepped onto the terrace, the biting New York wind whipped around them. Evelyn immediately reached for him, her manicured fingers curling around his bicep. Usually, Ethan would wrap his arm around her waist, pulling her close against the cold, a gesture of protective warmth she always seemed to relish. Tonight, his body remained rigid, his arm hanging limply at his side like dead weight. Evelyn's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, her perfectly sculpted brow furrowing slightly. She leaned in, her lips brushing against his ear, her voice dropping to a harsh, demanding whisper beneath the wind. "What is wrong with you? The photographer is waiting. Put your arm around me." "I'm cold, Evelyn," he replied flatly, staring straight ahead at the glittering skyline, refusing to meet her eyes. The scent of her expensive perfume, previously intoxicating, now smelled overwhelmingly of deceit, masking the lingering trace of Chad's cologne that still clung to her. "Don't do this now," she hissed, her grip on his arm tightening, her nails biting into his tuxedo jacket. "Not tonight. This is my night. Smile." The photographer called out from across the terrace. "Beautiful, you too. Just a little closer, Ethan. Look at her like she's the only woman in the world." Ethan finally turned his head. He looked down at the woman he thought he knew, the woman he had funded, supported, and loved unconditionally. He looked at the flawless makeup, the calculating eyes, and the sheer audacity of her demands. He didn't see his wife anymore. He saw a brilliantly executed corporate strategy standing in an emerald gown. He forced a tight, thin smile, wrapping a stiff arm around her waist, ensuring his hand rested flat against the cold silk, completely avoiding the warmth of her skin. "Perfect," he whispered, his eyes locking onto hers with an icy intensity that made her visibly flinch. Just a perfect picture, isn't it? The moment the camera flashes died down and the magazine crew began packing their gear, Ethan excused himself. He cited a sudden headache from the champagne, slipping away from Evelyn's sharp, questioning gaze before she could formulate an argument. He didn't head toward the exit. Instead, he navigated through the labyrinthine corridors of the Sterling building, seeking sanctuary from the suffocating corporate celebration. He found a secluded, executive balcony overlooking the city, far from the booming bass of the reception below. The cold night air whipped against his face, a sharp contrast to the burning anger tight in his chest. Ethan pulled his phone from his tuxedo pocket, the screen illuminating his face in the dim light. The anonymous message sat at the top of his notifications, an unread grenade waiting to detonate his life. He stared at the unlisted number for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the screen. Who would send this? Why tonight? He opened the message thread, his eyes tracing the undeniable, high-resolution proof of his wife's infidelity. The hotel hallway photo, the intimate text exchange. It wasn't enough just to know she was cheating. He needed to know how deep the rot went. Ethan had always respected Evelyn's privacy, never once prying into her devices during their 7 years of marriage. But tonight, the rules of engagement had irrevocably changed. He opened a secure, encrypted file-sharing app he used for high-level venture capital deals. He knew Evelyn's password habits. She used a complex variation of their wedding date and the address of her childhood home across all her accounts. It was a detail he had always found endearing, a symbol of her sentimental attachment to their union. Now he realized it was just a convenient security protocol. He accessed her personal cloud storage, his fingers flying across the digital keyboard with practiced precision. The initial folders were innocuous: PR campaigns, investor spreadsheets, high-end vacation itineraries. But then he found a hidden, heavily encrypted folder buried deep within a subdirectory labeled Archive Projections. His heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs as he typed in the familiar password variation. The lock icon vanished. The folder opened. It was a digital graveyard of their marriage. Ethan's eyes widened as he scrolled through hundreds of files. Photos of Evelyn and Chad in various cities: London, Paris, Tokyo, always taken during the solo business trips she claimed were essential for securing international funding. There were PDFs of flight itineraries booked under assumed names and receipts for exorbitant gifts, including the bespoke Swiss chronometer he had spotted on Chad's wrist earlier. The betrayal wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment or a drunken mistake. It was a meticulously planned, long-term operation. She had been living a double life for years, funded almost entirely by the venture capital Ethan had poured into Ashford Media Group to support her dreams. He leaned against the cold stone railing, the city lights blurring before his eyes. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. He wasn't just a cuckold. He was the primary investor in his own humiliation. Then his eyes caught a single, text-based document titled Exit Strategy Phase 3. He tapped it, the screen glaring brightly against the darkness of the balcony, his thumb hovering over the first line of text. The cold wind biting at Ethan on the secluded balcony of the Sterling building was nothing compared to the ice forming in his veins as he read the document titled Exit Strategy Phase 3. It wasn't a business plan for Ashford Media Group. It was a blueprint for his own destruction. His eyes scanned the digital page, the harsh glare of the phone screen illuminating words that felt like physical blows. The document, dated exactly 3 months before Ethan had even met Evelyn, outlined a meticulously constructed timeline. It was a joint manifesto authored by Evelyn and Chad Hunter. Phase 1. Secure initial funding through targeted relationship building. Ethan Clark identified as primary target due to high liquid assets and vulnerability following his previous venture failure. Ethan leaned heavily against the stone railing, his knuckles white as he gripped his phone. He remembered the night they met. He had been reeling from a disastrous tech investment, feeling lost and unsure of his judgment. Evelyn had appeared like a beacon, brilliant, empathetic, and full of a fierce, driving ambition that he found intoxicating. She had listened to his failures and promised him a future built on mutual trust and unstoppable success. It was all a script. He scrolled down, his breath hitching in his chest. Phase 2. Establish marriage as a legally binding financial partnership. Utilize Clark's network to secure Ashford Media Group's market position. Maintain illusion of exclusivity until Series C funding is finalized. The marriage wasn't a union of love. It was a legal instrument designed solely to funnel his capital and industry leverage into their shared empire. The 7 years of shared laughter, quiet mornings, and whispered promises were nothing more than a carefully executed performance piece to keep the investor, him, pliable and generous. He read the final section, his vision blurring slightly. Phase 3. Trigger dissolution post-IPO. Ensure prenuptial clauses are circumvented through strategic narrative framing. Chad to assume CEO role. Evelyn to secure majority shareholder status. The nausea rose sharp and bitter in the back of his throat. The watch on Chad's wrist wasn't just a symbol of infidelity. It was a victory lap. Tonight's award, her speech thanking her real partner. It was all a twisted inside joke between two con artists who had successfully pulled off the ultimate heist. He hadn't been building a legacy with his wife. He had been funding his own replacement. He locked the phone, the screen plunging him back into darkness. The sounds of the city below, sirens, traffic, the distant hum of a million lives, felt entirely disconnected from the suffocating silence expanding within him. He had two choices. He could storm the ballroom, throw the digital evidence in their faces, and watch the Ashford Media Group burn to the ground in a public spectacle of vengeance. Or he could play their game, return to the penthouse they shared, and meticulously dismantle the empire he had unwittingly built for them. Ethan pocketed his phone, his jaw set in a rigid, unforgiving line. He straightened his tuxedo jacket, the fabric feeling heavy, like armor. He would not give them the satisfaction of a public breakdown. The performance wasn't over yet. He turned away from the skyline and walked back toward the blinding lights of the gala. The interior of the chauffeured Maybach was a cocoon of buttery leather and hushed silence as it glided away from the Sterling building. The partition separating them from the driver was firmly raised. The neon blur of the New York skyline washed over the tinted windows, casting harsh, fleeting shadows across Evelyn's face. She was practically vibrating with adrenaline, her emerald gown catching the intermittent streetlights. Tonight was flawless, Ethan, she breathed, kicking off her designer heels and leaning back against the plush seat. The investors were practically eating out of my hand. Did you see Harrison's face during the speech? We've secured the Series C funding. I know it. Ethan remained perfectly still on his side of the spacious cabin. He didn't turn to look at her. The air between them felt thick, oxygen-deprived. The earlier chill of the balcony had settled permanently in his bones. Yes, Ethan said softly, his voice devoid of the congratulatory warmth she was accustomed to. It was quite a performance. Evelyn turned her head slightly, her brow furrowing. The adrenaline seemed to stutter, replaced by a sudden, wary alertness. A performance? It was the culmination of everything we've worked for. I've worked for. I know, Ethan replied, his tone smooth, almost conversational. He finally turned his head, his eyes locking onto hers in the dim light. I especially appreciated the shout-out to your real partner. It was a very touching, very specific choice of words. A microscopic tremor passed over Evelyn's flawless features. It was so fast, so perfectly contained, that Ethan would have missed it if he hadn't spent the last hour dissecting her every micro-expression. You're my partner, Ethan, she said smoothly, reaching a hand out to rest on his knee. You know what I meant. The foundation. Ethan looked down at her hand. The heavy diamond engagement ring he had bought her, a symbol of a promise she never intended to keep, flashed mockingly in the passing streetlights. He gently, but firmly, picked up her hand and placed it back on her own lap. I think we both know exactly who you were thanking, Evelyn, Ethan said, his voice dropping an octave, the icy calm finally cracking slightly to reveal the steel underneath. I just didn't realize until tonight that he was wearing my anniversary gift on his wrist. The silence in the car became deafening. The gentle hum of the engine seemed to amplify the sudden, erratic rhythm of Evelyn's breathing. She stared at him, her eyes wide, the calculation behind them working at a furious pace. "Ethan, you've had too much champagne. You're not making sense," she started, her voice tight, defensive. "Chad bought that watch himself in Geneva." "Stop," Ethan commanded, the words slicing through the quiet air like a blade. He didn't raise his voice, but the absolute, crushing finality in his tone made her mouth snap shut. He reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out his phone. He unlocked it, the bright screen illuminating the dark cabin, and brought up the first high-resolution photo from the anonymous sender. He held it up, the screen mere inches from her face. The image of her pressed against the hotel wall, lost in Chad Hunter's embrace, was undeniable. Evelyn physically recoiled, her back pressing hard against the leather seat. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking pale and ghost-like under the streetlights. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The polished, unshakable CEO of Ashford Media Group had vanished, replaced by a woman staring down the barrel of her own destruction. "It's an impressive watch," Ethan continued, his voice terrifyingly calm as he swiped to the next photo, the text exchange. "But it's the exit strategy Phase 3 document that really caught my attention. The one outlining how you and Chad plan to use my capital from day one." He watched her eyes dart across the screen, the realization dawning on her that this wasn't just a suspicion. It was a total, catastrophic exposure of her entire reality. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling, the first genuine sound he had heard from her in years. "7 years, Evelyn," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes completely dead. 7 years of being the perfect understudy while you and Chad directed the show. "Tell me, when did the Series C funding become more important than the man you married?" The Maybach turned onto the quiet, exclusive street of the Meridian, the imposing facade of their luxury apartment building looming ahead. The drive was over, and so was the illusion. The elevator ride to the penthouse at the Meridian was suffocatingly silent. The heavy oak doors of their apartment swung open, revealing the sprawling, minimalist expanse Ethan had funded entirely. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering Manhattan skyline, a cold, mocking reflection of the empire they had supposedly built together. Evelyn walked in, dropping her evening bag onto the sleek marble kitchen island with a sharp, echoing thud. The sudden, uncharacteristic lack of grace in her movement signaled the end of her performance. The terrified woman in the Maybach had vanished, replaced by the calculating, ruthless CEO who had authored his financial execution. She poured herself a generous measure of scotch from the crystal decanter, her hand perfectly steady. "All right, Ethan," she said, her voice stripped of any warmth or theatricality. She didn't look at him. "You've seen the files. You've seen the photos. What is your asking price?" Ethan stood by the doorway, the heavy tuxedo jacket suddenly feeling suffocating. He watched her sip the amber liquid, the emerald gown pooling around her designer heels. She wasn't begging for forgiveness. She was assessing damage control. "My asking price," Ethan repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Evelyn finally turned, leaning against the cold marble, her eyes locked onto his with an icy, pragmatic intensity. "Don't play naive now. We are both adults who understand the value of a solid investment. The Series C funding hinges on our united front. If you blow this up, if you file for a messy, public divorce, Ashford Media tanks. Your initial capital, your shares, everything you've poured into this company over the last 7 years, goes up in smoke." She set the glass down, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming a slow, rhythmic beat against the counter. "I am offering you a very simple, very lucrative business arrangement. We remain legally married. We maintain the public narrative. You retain your board seat and a significantly increased dividend payout. In exchange, you turn a blind eye to my personal life. Chad and I will be discreet. You get richer, the company thrives, and we avoid mutually assured destruction." The sheer audacity of her proposal hung in the silent, expansive room. She was offering him a gilded cage, constructed entirely from the profits of her betrayal. 7 years of his life, his love, his trust, reduced to a line item on a corporate balance sheet, negotiable for a higher dividend yield. Ethan slowly walked toward the kitchen island, his footsteps muffled by the thick, Persian rug. He stopped a few feet away from her, his face a perfectly blank canvas. He reached up, his fingers brushing against the heavy platinum band on his left hand. The ring he had worn proudly, a symbol of a vow he had believed was sacred. He slid it off his finger. The metal felt suddenly foreign, cold, and entirely meaningless. He didn't throw it at her. He didn't scream. The anger had burned out, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. He placed the ring gently onto the cold, unforgiving surface of the marble countertop. It sat there, a tiny, glittering monument to a spectacular lie. "I don't negotiate with frauds, Evelyn," Ethan said softly, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, empty penthouse. "And I don't finance my own humiliation." He turned away from the woman he had loved, away from the glittering skyline he had helped her conquer, and walked steadily toward the heavy oak doors. He didn't look back as he grabbed his coat from the entryway. "The show is over, Evelyn," Ethan said quietly, the finality of his words hanging in the cold air. "And so is my role as your understudy." He closed the door behind him, the heavy click of the lock sealing the tomb of their marriage forever.